Hi, this video is to provide some instruction for the A-Push document-based question, or DBQ. The DBQ is a 7-point assessment. A couple of the points are similar to the LEQ, such as the first point, which is the thesis or claim. Like the LEQ, it has to be historically defensible, and it has to establish a line of reasoning. A little bit more specific, it should be probably 2 sentences. Some people say 3 are acceptable. I think you should try to keep it tight into 2 complex sentences, and it should be in your introduction. You could still get the point if it's in your conclusion, but that's not a really great way to sort of approach a DBQ or any kind of writing. You should usually have your thesis in your introduction. The next point is contextualization. And again, just like in the LEQ, you need to set the stage. And this is what introduces the topic so that when you are explaining your argument, it has some, context. And I'm going to be showing you some examples of good contextualization and poor contextualization, so you can sort of see that difference. There are 3 evidence points in the DBQ. The first point is probably the easiest. It just says that you have to use 3 of your documents, and there are 7 total documents. You have to use the content of at least 3 to address the topic of the prompt. Okay. It has to be clear that you understand them. So you don't want to just quote them, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you understand them. So you need to be able to explain them. The second point supports an argument in response to the prompt using at least 6 documents. And this one, not only do you have to be able to explain the documents, they need to be able to promote, further advance the argument that you made in your thesis. The third point is evidence beyond the documents, and this can't be used as a point for anything else. So you can't have something in your contextualization and say, well, look, I have outside evidence there. It has to stand for either your contextualization or your outside evidence. It can't be both. So to earn this point, you have to use at least 1 additional piece of specific historical evidence, something that is not mentioned anywhere in any of the 7 documents. It also needs to be relevant to your argument, and even better, it needs to advance your argument and exist there for the goal of proving your argument. Then there are 2 analysis and reasoning points. For the first one, it says for at least 3 documents, explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and or audience is relevant. You do not have to do all of those. This is your CAP POV, context, audience, purpose, and point of view. You don't have to do them all. You can do just POV for one of the documents, maybe just audience for another document, and I'll show you what this looks like in some examples later. And to get that last analysis and reasoning point, this is the complexity point. And just like in the LEQ, this one is a little hard to explain. It's one of those things that as a scorer, you know it when you see it. And essentially, this means that you have created a complex, sophisticated, nuanced piece of writing where you demonstrate that nothing is cut and dried, nothing is black and white, that even though this may seem true, there are these other issues that play a part of it too. You can do it by looking at different perspectives, different variables, looking at both similarity and difference, continuity and change. Remember, you always have to do both sides. Multiple causes and effects. So you never want to just say things like the French and Indian War caused the American Revolution or the Declaration of Independence. That's so simplistic. There are so many more issues involved in that, and a good essay, especially one that earns this point, would demonstrate that. Zinn is a really good resource for adding complexity to your writing. because he always presents the point of view of the loser. And so most of your texts will do the winner, essentially. And this is a good way to demonstrate different perspectives. Something that maybe isn't mainstream, but something else that could be considered when looking at your argument. So now we're going to take a look at an example document-based question, a prompt, and some documents. These are the instructions here at the top that will generally be at the beginning of any of your DBQ assessments. And then you will have the prompt. And in this case, the prompt is analyze the extent to which political and economic changes reshaped American society between 1820 and 1848. Below this question, you will see that you have the 7 documents that you need to use in your essay. Okay, so how do you begin? How do you even start? Well, what I recommend is that you deconstruct the prompt before you even look at any of the documents. Look at the question, look what the question's asking you for, determine what you know. So, using this as an example, let's look at it. So first of all, look at the dates. You always need to stay within the dates. 1820 to 1848. So hopefully, if you're looking at this question, you are saying, okay, so 1820, that's when the Missouri Compromise happened, and 1848, that's the end of the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Okay, so a bunch of things happened in between there. You have Jackson as president, you have Harrison and Van Buren, you have the creation of the Whig Party, you have the Panic of 1837, you have different sectional and border disputes about certain things. You had the end of the Federal Bank of the United States. So the first thing you should do is sort of generate in your mind, and maybe even jot this down on your paper, what actually is going on in this time period. Then you're going to look, it says political and economic. Now, College Board loves these 3 categories: political, economic, and social. Sometimes they ask them all in the beginning. This one is asking you actually to apply political changes and economic changes and demonstrate how they reshape society or the people. How did they affect the people? So they don't want you just to talk about political changes. It's about how political changes shaped American society. How did it affect the people? How did economic changes affect the people? Okay, so that's deconstructing your prompt. So let's talk for a second, then you might go, okay, so what political things? Well, as I mentioned before, it could be Jackson and his populist movement. It could be the Whig Party that was a response to disliking Andrew Jackson. Political things could also be treaties, like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It could be the Missouri Compromise. It could be some of the decisions that Andrew Jackson made regarding the different Indian nations. There are a lot of different options that you can take there. Then you have some economic things. What was happening for economically? Well, there was that panic of 1837 from overspeculation. There was the decision to get rid of the Bank of the United States and take all the federal funds out of it and put it in all these wildcat banks throughout the country. It was the market revolution. It was a time when textile production was affecting both North and South. It was encouraging, actually sort of demanding the use of slavery in order to create the kind of profit that they wanted. All right, so now you've come up with some different ideas. Now you have to say, okay, how did those things affect people? How did economic changes affect people? For economic changes, you could talk about the immigrant experience. You could talk about the African American experience or the women's experience, maybe going to work in factories, immigrants coming in from Germany and from Ireland looking for economic success. For political, changes. You could talk about, again, perhaps how, the effects on slavery, the effects on people's economy, when they closed the Bank of the United States, um, the fact that people were becoming a little bit more polarized in terms of slavery. So, one more time looking at it, political changes, how did they affect society? Economic changes, how do they affect society? And College Board will always say that the number one thing kids do wrong when they're answering these questions, is not answering the entire question. So only now that you have looked at the prompt, deconstructed the prompt, you should perhaps create a temporary thesis statement at this time. How would you argue that? Not even looking at the documents. How would you argue that? Say if it was an LEQ, what would your thesis be? Then once you've done that, you're going to go back and you're going to read through each of the documents. You're going to do a quick POV cap for each of the documents: context, audience, purpose, point of view. Okay, so you're going to read it, say, what is this about? Why would John Quincy Adams write this? Who was he writing it to? What is he explaining? What is he talking about? And you'll do the same thing for all 7 documents. And then, because you already have a couple categories up here, political and economic changes, you could now sort these. Which ones talk about political changes? Which ones talk about economic changes? And then you'll know where to use the different documents as evidence, or I should say support for your argument. If it has something to do with society, you might want to underline that or note that. Okay, so say that this one is a political one, and then it talks about, I'm just going quickly, like the Missouri slave question. You could say, okay, this is maybe the social issue that has to do with this political topic. So you sort, you organize, you figure out where you're going to use things. Then you're going to create a quick outline and then start writing. And the outline, you can organize this any way that you want. You could do political changes, economic changes, and then how all those changes shaped society. Or you could do political changes and how they shape society, and economic changes and how they shape society, and then perhaps a third paragraph about what is the extent, like how much, what was more important, which was caused more change or was more significant than the other ones, because you can't forget that part of the question. Analyze the extent to which. Okay. In this, they don't want you just to describe changes. They want you to say, what changes were the most impactful on American society? So you have to take a stand there. And, I wouldn't waste too much time trying to decide how much you really believe in something. If you feel like you can make a good argument for something, even though maybe you're thinking, oh, I don't know if I think that's really true, I would go with that. You don't have a lot of time here. You have 60 minutes to write this entire essay. So the next thing I want to show you is there's this website, and it is called Apprend. I don't know if that's how you say that or not, but if you wanted to check it out for yourself, because I'm just going to briefly go through it, you can see that here is the address up here at the top of the page. So what I like about this site is they show the differences between good contextualization, poor contextualization, good thesis, poor thesis, etc. And it says here, students who score a 5 on the APUSH exam do 2 things very well. First, they know how to earn each point of the 7, which is one of the reasons I spend so much time talking about make sure you get that contextualization point. Make sure you get that outside evidence point. If you know what the points are, then you can construct your essay in such a way to make sure that you hit all 7 of those points. This is a great graphic to look at. Download, maybe I'll see if I can get some copies of it, but it just sort of lays out all of the 7 points there. All right, we're not going to go through every single thing on this site, but it's a pretty good site, and you can look at some of the videos and things that they have. I do want to show you the sample prompt. that they're using to describe things. It says, evaluate the relative importance of different factors that caused the movement for American independence between 1754 and 1776. In your response, consider both the underlying forces and specific events that contributed to the growing support for independence. All right, so let's deconstruct that prompt quickly before we get started. So relative importance, evaluating the relative importance, that would indicate that you need to sort of quantify or qualify what's more important, which had more impact. Of different factors caused the movement for American independence between 1754 and 1776. Here you're looking at your dates, and hopefully you're looking at that and saying, all right, that's the beginning of the French and Indian War, and that is the year that Declaration of Independence was crafted and accepted. Right, so now we have a basic time frame. In your response, consider both the underlying forces. Okay, this is things like Thomas Paine's common sense, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract theory, John Locke's ideas about natural rights of man, and specific events, Stamp Act, French and Indian War, Continental Congress, the Albany Plan of Union, Intolerable Act, Stamp Act, all of those things. Those are specific events. The forces are more the ideas that are affecting the colonists' opinions. So again, you're looking at this, you have to do all of these things. You are evaluating and quantifying, and you're looking at both underlying forces and specific events. So this gives you 7 documents to use in this example that they're showing. Okay. And now let's go back and look at how they break this down. If you want to, you can look at the actual sample essay responses, and you can see this, what the 7 looks like, or what I think there's a 1 and maybe a 4 in there. All right. So let's talk first about the thesis. Establish a historical or defensible accurate claim. Okay, we've talked about that. This is all stuff that we've talked about. Now let's look at some examples. If you remember, this is the prompt up here that we just talked about. Thesis 1. There were many reasons for the American Revolution. The colonists were angry at the British and wanted to revolt. There were also many events that led to the revolution between 1754 and 1776. I see a lot of thesis statements that look like this. Overly general, not specific, not taking a stand, just saying it is, and that's it. Your second thesis, there were a number of factors that caused Americans to revolt. The British did not want to let the colonies have their own trade. They violated individual rights, right? So we're talking about some different issues versus underlying forces. Events that show these violations were acts such as the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. And then now we're going to evaluate it. Probably the most important reason was the violation of natural rights for those without. For without those, there's no freedom. So now you see that this person has actively answered the different parts of the prompt. Not very artfully. It's not very sophisticated. But this would get the thesis point. This one would not. But this one would get just barely the thesis point. Now let's see this thesis, which is excellent. In short, though the Enlightenment, and this is always good when you're saying, though this, but this. Those are good techniques to use with thesis statements. In short, though the Enlightenment principles of John Locke's social contract and the belief in inalienable rights were a strong foundation for the revolution, the fact was that the colonists would not tolerate a perceived stifling of their economic rights. So they have addressed both parts of the forces and events. Okay. And now I shouldn't say that. They address the forces and say, yeah, these existed, and now they're going to create the importance factor, they're evaluating the importance, but it was actually excessive taxation and denial of economic self-sufficiency for well over a century that were the true causes of the revolution. Enjoying the fruits of their own labor and economic liberty were prizes too big not to revolt. So they have made a defensible stand and said, you know what? Those ideas certainly played a role, but it was actually the economic issues that drove the colonists towards independence. All right. So looking at this site's evaluation, in thesis one that would not get the point, the student does not establish a line of reasoning for the essay. Colonists were angry, doesn't give you any reason why, and it doesn't introduce any importance of one thing over another. Two says that it does violate economic and natural rights, talks about importance, saying that natural rights are more important. It's pretty simplistic. It's not very sophisticated, but it does the job and just barely meets that threshold for earning the thesis point. And of course, the third one, student correctly identifies the underlying forces for the revolution as economic discrimination against the colonists, violations of Enlightenment principles by the Crown. Student also maintains that the economic reasons were more significant. Okay, so that answers that relative importance question. Okay. A lot of DBQs are going to ask you to what extent, how much, evaluate, and in your answer, you need to take a stand of how much or what you could say that they are equal. You could say that one is more, you could say that one is less, however you want to do it, but you definitely have to talk about the extent to which. For contextualization, we've talked about this before. You're situating the development into the time period. It's not background information. It is setting the stage for this is what the world looks like that these events are going to play a role in. Okay, so contextualization focuses on big themes, ideas, and developments that influence the specific question. You should always, regardless of what this says, you should always do contextualization first, in my mind. Okay, here it's saying that you could do your thesis and then contextualization. Don't do it that way because you'll forget it, you'll miss it. So do your contextualization first, long, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Then give your thesis. Okay. All right, let's look at 3 examples. Remember what the prompt is. Here is the first one. There were many reasons for the American Revolution. The colonists were angry. I think I've read that before. What is it? Well, that's the thesis statement. I don't see any contextualization before, just jumps right into it. And then it goes straight into document analysis. So no contextualization in this first one. 2, Enlightenment ideas were ideas about liberty and individual rights. They began in the 18th century. Colonists thought their rights were being taken away in common sense, hereditary rights of kings, other rights taken away were in the Declaration, blah, 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 blah. And it's got some document things in here. Generally, your contextualization is not going to include anything with your documents in the DBQ. This contextualization example is as if someone just took as many things as they knew and just tried to throw them up against the wall to see what would stick. They don't really gel together. They don't really create a bigger picture. I'm not sure that I would give that a contextualization point. So let's look and actually see what they said. So contextualization number 1, there was no attempt. Okay, that's what I thought. Contextualization number 2, the attempt at the beginning to establish it with a discussion does not go over the bar for the point. Discussion needs more elaboration as to what the individual rights and principles were and how they were a fundamental cause of the revolution. So just like me, they didn't think that earned the contextualization point. Now let's look at some lovely contextualization. This is long, so what I really want you to do is pause this video right now and then take a minute and read it. When you're done, start her up again. Okay, so as you can see, this is very thorough. It's talking about the English landing at Jamestown. It's talking about mercantilism. It's talking about how the economy worked prior to this period of time and the things that were beginning to sort of point to problems. When the British caught on to colonial smuggling, they began to crack down. They took away trial by jury. And unbeknownst to the king, they'd now taken the first steps towards creating a revolution. Okay, lovely contextualization. Here it says, in the paragraph, the student thoroughly explains the system of mercantilism, the trade development that preceded. Now remember, if you remember this person's thesis, it was all about how the economic issues were the ones that really drove the revolution. So here they are starting with an introduction to what just prior to this question is going on economically in the colonies. So it says here, this is an extremely healthy explanation, and points would have been awarded even if it was half this length. So you do not need one that is this long in order to earn all of your points. But this is exceptionally well done. Okay, using documents. So it is important when you are writing a DBQ that your documents do not become the subject matter of your essay. You should not be just walking through all of the documents and explaining what they mean. Your documents exist and should be used to support an argument that you have already created. It's as if you'd gone out and done research, and these are the sources that you're going to use as annotations and things for your research or your essay. Okay. So we've talked about these here. And it says to get that first point, like I mentioned before, you just have to state the content of the document and relate it to the prompt. It's pretty straightforward. You have to do it for 3 of them. But for the second point, it's a little trickier. You have to use 6, but it has to advance the argument. Have you taken the idea of the document to advance? If so, you'll get credit. Okay, if you simply quote it without clearly demonstrating that 1, you know what it means, or 2, what the role is in terms of your argument, you probably won't get that point. Okay. Here are some examples of ways that you can use documents. This one, it says unity was another issue arising during this time. The 1754 Join or Die cartoon was an attempt to unite the colonies. The point of view of the cartoon is that of a rebel. So this person is definitely trying to do some cap POV here. And then what they were looking at is this right here. Okay, so you get this political cartoon. You see it is from Benjamin Franklin. If you remember from your studies, this was created right around the Albany Plan of Union. It was the first time that Ben Franklin was like, hey, if we all got together, we could actually sort of do something if we were all on the same page. Okay. This does not explain that. An attempt to unite the colonies, okay. It's the cartoon is the point of view of a rebel. Again, they're trying to establish some cat POV there. George Washington also attempted to bring the colonies together to support British manufacturing in order to reduce taxes. Okay, so now we're on sort of like a totally different bent, just so they could use a document. Though not all agreed with revolting, many did. Yeah, that doesn't give me anything. By 1776, the reasons were too great and the revolution began. All right, so let's see what they say down here. The reference to the content of document 1 is unclear, doesn't get credit. Over what issue is the cartoon attempting to unite them? You have to clarify that. So as I was saying here, it was an attempt to unite the colonies to fight the Native Americans and support the Albany Plan for Union. And so if you can't say what the context is for that political cartoon, you're probably not going to get that point. Okay. And while it is a step towards the revolution, it is not a direct line to the Constitution. And that's what the student said, is that it was, but it was not a direct line. That is a good example of not showing any complexity. Let's look at document use 2. In response to this task, this tax, the Virginia Assembly stated that there were only legitimately elected let me try that again. Stated that they were the only legitimately elected legislature that had the exclusive right and power to levy taxes. That's called a power quote. You should never put a quote in any essay, no matter it's a DBQ, LEQ, or anything else, where you use the entire quote. You want to use your language, your explanation, and just really pull those words that are powerful or that really could not be stated in any other way. Okay. This statement with the power quote of exclusive right and power to levy taxes, the reader knows that you understand that because of this statement here. The only legitimately elected legislature that could do these things. In addition to taxes, the economic right to private property was directly infringed upon, which the British troops would search anywhere and anywhere at time in their writs of assistance. So again, you are explaining something here. Sam Adams thought this, and you've explained it up here, was extremely tyrannical, for the British were violating personal security, personal liberty, and private property. This is from the fourth document. So here, what the writer has done is established Sam Adams's point of view. Okay, extremely tyrannical. British were violating. It's clear that he has a point of view and that you understand that Sam Adams is on the side opposed to the British at this time. Note how they cited the documents. Now you could put like Doc 2 or Doc 4, but just 2 or just 4, that's just fine. You do not want to state in document 2, it states. In document 4, it states. You have to sort of pretend like the documents are your backup research that really people only know about as because it would be like in your works cited. Okay, so step back away from the documents as being your evidence that completely explain your argument, or I should say that step away from it being your argument and use it as supporting evidence. So let's see what they say about 2. The student correctly, blah, blah, blah. Pay particular attention to how the student only uses power quotes to finish thoughts. Student takes the main idea, perspective, opinion of the document and ties it directly to the larger issue. All right. So now let's look at outside evidence. Okay. Let's see. 3 things to know. It must fall within the time period. Do not go outside. As I mentioned earlier, you cannot double dip for points. If something is in contextualization, it can't be used for outside evidence and vice versa. It's recommended, and I support this, that you try to use at least 2 to 3 pieces of outside evidence just to make sure that you get it. You only need 1, but sometimes you might not do that 1 very well. So if you have a few to choose from, that might help your score. So the first example, just take a second and read that. Pause it if you like. So there is a lot of information right there. Down here it says, it's not very elaborate. The discussion at the beginning of paragraph 3 concerning taxation goes over the threshold to reach the point. So it gets there, not very well. It's something they have to think about probably, the scorers, and be like, does this work? Does this not work? And you don't want that. There's enough elaboration of what the taxes were and why they were offensive to get the point, but it's not super artfully done. Let's look at the second one. British taxation policies on the colonists were one of the most visible and atrocious acts perceived by the colonists. Again, we're establishing, quantifying and qualifying this. For over a century, the colonists had accepted the parliamentary taxes on foreign goods, external, blah, 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 sugar tax, sugar act parliament, internal taxation. Okay. It says in this paragraph, the student received the point for its clear and extensive discussion of taxation issues. It correctly brings forth the colonial distinctions between internal and external taxes, gives specific laws. There's your specific proper noun historical evidence. Note that the student brings in quite a bit of outside evidence throughout. To get this point, you only need to bring forth a single piece of evidence directly tied to the argument. But you can't just name drop. You can't just throw in, Sugar Act Parliament without any explanation or trying to connect it in any way back to your argument. Okay, so now looking at analysis, as I mentioned, your first point comes from using CAT POV for at least 3 documents. Historical context means, so you don't have to do all of them, you just have to do one of them per the 3 documents. And again, you might want to do 4 or even 5, just in case one of them doesn't quite reach the threshold. Historical context means, what is the context? What caused the document to be created? Why does it even exist? Okay. This is not your full contextualization for your argument. This just has to do with this document. Who's the audience? Who does the speaker want to hear this message? What's the whole purpose of writing this document? And what's the point of view of the writer or the creator? Okay. If you get a chart that's showing trends in immigration, that's probably not going to have point of view, but it may have historical context or it may have purpose. Okay, so understand that not all 4 of these work for every single piece or every document that you see. Use the one that makes the most sense. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, here are some examples of historical context. Here's an example of attendant audience. As an attempt to convince the colonists. So that's the purpose of it. Point of view. You've got Sam Adams, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, tried to bring about revolution. So it's very clear on which side Sam Adams came from. Okay, now as I mentioned before, the reasoning point, complex understanding, corroborating, it's an overall idea, but also you can do that sort of opposition statement. So highlighting contradictions can add depth to your essay and demonstrate that you understand it in a meaningful way. Here's an example that's not from this topic. During the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, Republicans cut spending on social programs to reduce government. However, in the name of fiscal responsibility, they increased defense spending. So sometimes you want to point out contradictions. I mean, like for instance, Andrew Jackson is sort of a walking contradiction. He's all about the people and the public and the populist movement, but he also thought that he should have a lot of power individually. Demonstrating that contradiction is a good way to show complexity. Okay, so coming back to some of these other documents, again, there's so many different things that you could look at. This one has to do with just general tips about writing, many that I just included before. Okay. Transitions and evidence. Transition words are a really good way to demonstrate that you understand what's going on here, the historical thinking skills. Okay, so causal transition, cause and effect. Let's look at cause and reason, or effect and result transition words. For the purpose of, with this intention, as a result, consequently. Using those words demonstrate that you understand what the historical thinking skill is. So it might be helpful to sort of look through a few of those and kind of put some of them in your arsenal. Okay. The other thing to show you, finally, is the ways to refer to documents. It says here, documents may be used implicitly or explicitly. So you don't want to say in document 1, it says. Instead, and let's go back and say that it is that John Quincy Adams one. Instead, you would say, John Quincy Adams suggested in his diary that, and so now you don't need to say in document 1. Instead, after you talk about it, you would put doc 1 or a 1 in parentheses at the end of the statement. Okay. Or Again, so you're going to refer to it by its author or by what it is. Okay, so if you had something looking at German, a graph that showed German and Irish immigration, then you could, in a statement where you're talking about that, the new opportunities, economic opportunities in the United States brought German and Irish immigrants in, specifically between the years of this and this. And then you could put that graph as your, say that was document 2. You could just put a 2 at the end of that. Okay. That might not be one that you get that CAT VOP or POV point for, but you would get the point for using it. So I do encourage you to look through these different documents. And then when you sit down to write your actual DBQ, again, remember, try to figure out your topic, what you're going to write about, what your possible argument is. Deconstruct the prompt before you even look at the documents. I'll repeat again that if you read the documents before coming up with your argument, quite often you make your arguments based on the documents, and that is not what the scorers want to read. They want your argument, and they want to see how you can use outside evidence to support your argument. All right, I think that's all I have to say, so good luck.